Winter's over, the drought has ended. Testing is completed, and Formula One is back in action. The season opening Grand Prix from Bahrain is in the books, and Corey and I are here to break down all the action. We'll talk briefly about the history of the Bahrain Grand Prix. Our Tech Corner returns, where we'll have the first of our two-part dive into the work that goes into setting up a Formula One car. And Corey will put my mental acuity through its paces in our Stump the Pundit segment. With the precision of a McLaren pit stop and the humor of a Tsanoda radio transmission, F1 Brake Check is mashing the throttle. All right, ladies and gentlemen, F1 Brake Check is back. With me, as always, is my intrepid co-host, Corey Brune. Corey, how you doing this week?
Good. We had an exciting, well, no, it was not exciting. It was probably one of the more boring Grand Prix that we've seen in some time now. Not only just Max, but even everybody else in the field. There was a good 2 to 3 seconds between each driver and just not a whole lot of overtaking.
It had a few moments, but yes,
for the most part. Moments, yeah, but not. It wasn't the return. You know what I mean? It was just like,
yeah, it felt a little anticlimactic.
Exactly right. Exactly right.
So, but the thing is, though, is that and we'll talk more about this in the news section. There's definitely a reasoning behind why it was not as exciting as what we had hoped for.
We were really looking forward to a very solid race. And everything that we saw on pre-testing, preseason, really showed that everybody else, including Red Bull, but we had some really strong contenders. And then come race day, it was just like Max was up 20, 30 seconds at times. He was basically, from the off start, he was pretty much gone. And then that left everybody else in the field. I was really hoping for a little bit more excitement, but there's always 23 more races.
Yep, that's exactly it. Like I said, it did have a few moments and everything.
Yeah.
Like I said, we'll talk about it in the news section here. Everybody, for some reason, being the first race of the season or whatever, everybody played it really conservatively. And I don't know if that's a product of, because it is going to be such a long season, if maybe everybody's already planning on coordinating things around go for more performance, because we know that the parts on the power unit are at their end of the life, and so if they blow up, we already know that they've got to be replaced. Now, I don't know if it's because of that, but I think that everybody just, for the most part, played it pretty conservatively at this week's Grand Prix. All right, so in our history corner, we're going to do a brief history of the Bahrain Grand Prix. The first Bahrain Grand Prix was held in 2004, and the 2024 edition marks the 20th anniversary. Making history as the first Grand Prix to be held in the Middle East and the second F1 event ever to be held at night, starting with the 2014 edition. Despite the incredible racing, drama and controversy have plagued the Grand Prix as well. In 2011, due to what the media coined as the Bahrainian Uprising, in which anti-government protesters staged a series of protests against the monarch, some of which did turn violent. Because of the human rights violations from the government in attempting to stop the protests, a number of the top drivers, including Damon Hill and Mark Webber, boycotted the 2011 race, and the teams voiced concerns about safety, which led to the event being canceled. There were also calls for the 2012 edition to be canceled as well, but the event went on as planned. Known for its long, high-speed straights, punctuated with flowing sections of corners and elevation changes, and 2 tight hairpins, the course also features unusually large runoff areas and is considered one of the safest in the world. It was the site of one of the scariest crashes in recent memory when Romain Grosjean was nudged off the track and his car broke through the lower barrier and wedged itself. The car then erupted into flames. Grosjean was able to extricate himself and run to safety in the hands of the course marshals, who arrived on scene in moments, and he only suffered minor burns on his hands and feet. Bahrain is one of those really interesting tracks in the fact that when you first look at it, it doesn't look all that interesting, because being in the middle of a former camel farm it looks like it would be a really, really boring track. This year notwithstanding, it has generally produced some pretty good racing in the past,
Agreed.
despite being in the middle of the desert.
This year was a little bit off because typically the racing is really great at Bahrain, but this one was not it.
Yeah, no, it definitely was not. On to our tech corner. This is part of our ongoing series of where we take and talk about technological aspects of Formula One. And we take kind of a deeper dive into the technology of Formula One, but at the same time, we also will discuss the history of and oftentimes how we got to this point. This week, we're going to dive into setting up an F1 car, how long it takes, what all is involved. But because this topic is so large, this is actually going to be part one of 2 parts. So we'll do the second part next week. And this first week, what we're going to do is we can talk about some general setting up a Formula One car, and we're going to dive into the aerodynamics and the suspension setups of a Formula One car. The first thing to keep in mind is that every single one of the teams have, even with a relative new team like Haas, they've still been in the sport for 8, 9, 10 years, but even they have literally mountains of data on every single track that they visit. The teams keep very meticulous notes about every change and everything that they do to the cars on a given Grand Prix weekend. The actual setup of the cars actually starts days, sometimes weeks ahead of the car actually arriving at a circuit for a Grand Prix weekend. When the car first returns back to the team's factory, the team will actually strip down the car almost to its bones. They'll remove all of the bodywork. They'll remove the wheels and the tires. They'll remove the front and rear wings. They'll do an analysis of the tub and the crash structures of the car. They'll inspect all of the suspension components, oftentimes depending upon if they're going from a high-speed circuit to a lower speed circuit or a street circuit like Monaco. They'll actually change out suspension components. Using the data that the teams have collected over the years, the engineers will put all of that data into a simulator, and the simulator will then run through literally millions of variables and everything for the upcoming Grand Prix, and it will spit out a suggested setup for the car. And then the mechanics will take and then go about setting up the car based upon those specs that simulations spit out. And that will set up the car to about 90% of what they're going to need for a Grand Prix weekend. It'll give them a starting point for the suspension and the aero and the engine mapping and all of the electronics for the differential and everything else. So once they have all of that set up on the car, so when the cars arrive at the circuit, they're probably at about 90% of where they need to be. And then the drivers will climb in, and in FP1, they'll start running through various simulations. During each practice, they will actually have a program that they will follow that, and by program, I mean like a list of things that they're going to do with the cars. Usually free practice, FP1, oftentimes you will see a lot of changes in the running order and the times between FP1 and FP2 because the teams will be doing different things with the car based upon the programs that the engineers have already laid out. Then at some point, either in FP1 or FP2, they'll start working on their race setup. Now, for the race setup, when they arrive at the track, about 90% of the car is already set up. And then that's when they start doing the fine tuning. All of this takes and goes into fine tuning the car to the driver's preferences, because when it really boils down to is the driver's comfort. The more comfortable the driver is in the car, the faster the driver, theoretically, the faster the driver should be able to take and drive the car. So now we'll go ahead and dive into 2 of the elements that are probably the most important parts of setting up a Formula One car. That's the aerodynamics. In addition to the wings that most people notice when they're looking at a Formula One car, there's also a number of other movable tuning vanes. There's a number of other small little elements that the teams can make little tweaks to to take and help improve the airflow based upon the particular circuit that they're at. So what goes into tuning the aero? First thing we'll talk about is the front wings. Front wings have a maximum of 3 elements. If you're looking at the front of the wing, you have a bottom element, a middle element, and a top element. And most of the time, those elements will actually be all tied together. So when the team makes a small adjustment to the wing elements, it will either raise or lower the wing element, and subsequently it will raise all of the wing elements at the same time. Now, they're not all at the same angle. The bottom wing element may be at 3 degrees, the middle wing element may be at 8 degrees, and then the top wing element may be at 12 degrees. And then when they adjust them, the top element may move down from 12 degrees to 10 degrees, but the middle may only go from 8 to 9 degrees, and the bottom one may go from 4 degrees. It might go down to like 3.5 degrees. All of these are tuned, are very circuit specific in the way that they're set up. The wing setup on the front and the rear are very similar in the way that there are multiple elements, and the elements are all moved at the same time, and based upon where the team decides to set those elements at will determine how much downforce the car makes going into the corners, and conversely it will also change how much drag the car has going on the straightaways. The handful of things that will differ between the front wing and the rear wing is the rear wing is also limited to the number of elements that it can have, and those number of elements are different based upon the circuit. In the case where the top elements will usually be moved mostly at the same angle, like the beam wing that we've talked about before on the show. So you'll have the top 3 elements that are at the top of the wing, and then you have the beam wing, which is actually a wing element that is at the bottom of the rear wing that takes and sits just above the transmission casing. And that one is often used to generate downforce based upon air that is flowing from the underside of the car through the diffuser. And so oftentimes the angle of that wing will be set up different from the upper wing elements, so that it allows that the airflow can either, they can produce more downforce or they can create less drag based upon the way that they want to quote unquote shape the air as it's coming out of the diffuser. I've mentioned the diffuser, which is an area at the back of the car behind the power unit and the transmission that then takes the air that's flowing underneath the car and then sweeps it up, thus doing the exact same thing where it's creating a low pressure area underneath the car, which causes the car to suck down at the more downforce that it creates. One of the other things that I mentioned a minute ago, though, was about the other aerodynamic elements. So if you look closer on a Formula One car, you will notice that in addition to the front and rear wings, you'll notice that around the entrance to the floor of a Formula One car, you'll notice that there's a number of very small vertical quote unquote veins. That's what they're referred to as tuning veins. And they can take and increase or decrease the number of tuning veins based upon how little or how much they want to shape the air as it's going underneath the car into the ground effect tunnels under the car. You'll also see other tuning veins around the suspension components, so that way they can take and they can channel the air going into like the radiator inlets. So they can make all of these aerodynamic changes to the way that the car handles. And one of the things that they're always trying to do is they're always trying to create as little drag on the car as possible, because they always want the cars to be able to take and go down the straightaways as fast as possible. The more you can maintain the aerodynamic efficiency of the car in the corners and reduce the amount of drags going down the straightaways, the better off you are. All right, so now let's talk about the suspension, which is the other part that is probably the single most complicated and misunderstood parts of the car. Because most people who just look at a Formula One car, or who have a pretty rudimentary understanding of the way that their road car suspension works, don't understand all of the variables that go into a Formula One suspension. So with the suspension, there are a number of different components that are all working in tandem to make the car as efficient. The only thing that touches the ground on a Formula One car is the 4 tires. And the 4 tires are attached to the car by the suspension components. And so the suspension components are literally the single most important parts of any race car. Now, the major parts of the suspension, and we've talked about this before when we talked about tires a while back. So I'm not going to go into a lot of the parts about suspension itself, but more how the suspension is set up. As the suspension travels up and down, you have your dampers, which a lot of people will refer to as McPherson struts or shock absorbers. And that's the springs and the shock absorber slash damper itself, and the way that it takes and it moves up against the what's called a push rod, or in some cases a pull rod, which as the wheel moves, there's a rod that connects the wheels to a pivot point inside the car, and then that pivot point takes and operates against the dampers. In the case of setting up a Formula One car for a particular track, you want the car to have as little roll as possible. And so naturally, by the forces of physics, when a car goes into a corner, and everybody knows this because they've experienced it themselves when they've been in their road car, that when you turn into a corner, the natural tendency is for the car to take and the body of the car to take and roll in the opposite direction. Well, that roll takes and makes the car very unstable, because the wheel that is turning into the corner, then the weight tries to come off of that wheel. Formula One cars take and are absolutely maniacal in trying to reduce the amount of roll on a car as possible. They do that by adjusting the dampers, and they will adjust the spring rate, the damper itself, and then the bump. Spring rate can be adjusted on a Formula One car. All Formula One cars use what's called a coilover. With a traditional road car, the spring and the strut slash shock absorber will be actually 2 different parts. With a coilover, the spring is actually integrated on the shock absorber. They can adjust the spring rate, which is how much the spring will compress and decompress during a cornering maneuver, by adjusting 2 collars that are attached to the damper itself that can either take and compress the spring more or make the spring less compressed. In addition, they can adjust how much fluid is actually in the dampers that allows the damper to go in and out. And then the third part is what's called a bump, which on your average road car is a little bit of rubber. When the shock absorber takes and fully compresses, it will hit that bump to keep it from trying to go in even further and damaging the damper. So adjusting all of these parts are relatively routine. All of these things together take and make up part of the suspension setup. Adjusting the suspension is comprised of a couple of different things. So for the camber and for the toe, the cars will actually have on the hubs, which is where the tire is attached and the brakes are attached to the suspension wishbones that are then attached to the car. So in the hub itself, they will actually have a set of shims of different sizes. They'll pull out the size shims that correspond to however much or however little camber that they want in the wheels. For the spring rates, like I said, there are 2 collars that are attached to the coilover that they can take, and they can actually literally just turn those collars, which will then take and compress or uncompress the springs to take and increase the number of pounds per square inch that it requires to compress or fully decompress the spring. That is our first part of our 2-part series on setting up a Formula One car, how long it takes, how much effort is involved.
So on to Stump the Pundit.
Yes. All right. So now it's time for Stump the Pundit. So this is a segment where Corey will take and comes up with a trivia question. So Corey, what do you have for me this week?
It's still going on the same as we did last week as far as, do you know your driver? I have 2 drivers this week. So the first one, tell you some facts about them, and then you can guess who you think that is. He's another one that raced in Le Mans, just like Carlos Sainz has. He's been on several racing teams. I think it was 6 or 7 different racing teams. He started out actually in karting. He moved to F2 and became champion there. and this probably will nail it for you. He is the youngest to win a pole position. He holds that record, actually.
For a pole position for a Grand Prix?
Yeah.
Okay. My first instinct is to go with Alonso. But I don't think that's right. No, I don't think that's right because, I mean, Alonso did start in karting. He was an F2 champion. He has raced at Le Mans. I know it's not Verstappen because he doesn't hold that record. Okay. Okay, you got me completely stumped on that one.
Nico Hulkenberg.
Really?
Yes.
Wow. Yeah. I did not realize that. I didn't realize that Hulkenberg had actually ever had a pole position. I knew that he had qualified top 3 or 4 a couple times, but I did not realize he had actually had a pole position. And not only that, but the youngest pole sitter in Formula One history. That's wow. I would have never gotten that one.
He won it as a Williams driver.
All right.
Yeah. So on to the next one.
Okay.
He has 3 podiums, 1 Grand Prix win. He's raced 134 Grand Prix. He's also been on multiple teams. I think it was about 4 or 5. And he won GP3, which actually kickstarted his F1 career.
3 podiums, 1 win. I'm going to go with Ocon.
There you go. Yep. Up to our news section.
Yes. For the opening of the 2024 Grand Prix season, it was kind of an interesting in the fact that we had a Saturday Grand Prix, which is very rare. In fact, before Las Vegas last year, there hadn't been a Grand Prix on a Saturday in 40 plus years. Wow. And now we have the second Saturday Grand Prix in less than a year. A lot of people wondered why did they do that? Because they are racing this weekend in Saudi Arabia. The race will also be on Saturday night because Ramadan starts at sundown on Saturday night, Sunday morning. Because of that, of course, they can't have any racing on Sunday because of Ramadan, so they moved the race to Saturday. The sporting regulations says that there has to be at least 7 days between Grand Prix. So in order for them to have the Grand Prix in Bahrain and still maintain the 7-day split between Saudi Arabia, they had to have the Grand Prix on Saturday again.
On to Red Bull, more of the same.
Yep. So yes. So the Red Bulldozer picked up right where it left off last year with a phenomenal outing this weekend. Max Verstappen handled the race quite well. Pole position, led every lap. First place, a clean sweep for the whole weekend. But surprisingly enough, Checo, who didn't have as good a qualifying session as what the team had hoped for, he only qualified 5th, but he ends up through really great driving and really great strategy on the part of Red Bull. He was able to take and leapfrog over Sainz, Leclerc, and Russell and bring the car home for another Red Bull 1-2. Your thoughts?
The very first lap, you could already tell Max had it. You could just tell every lap he got further and further and further and further away. And at a certain point, nothing was said over the radio, but at a certain point, George had to start looking after his tires. I'm sure he gave up that race fairly quickly. He probably saw Verstappen and said, look, I'm not going to go after him. I'm not going to chase him and wear my tires down. I'm going to race my own race. And, he kept in it for quite some time. Unfortunately, Mercedes ended up where they ended up pretty much all of last year as well.
Yeah.
Mercedes did look good. I was talking to somebody earlier today about Mercedes, and one of the things that they had actually was they thought it was going to be cooler versus warmer. So they were running less temperature there. And that's the reason why, at least in theory, that's what Russell was saying, is that that's the reason why they were a little bit slower, anywhere up to 0.4 of a second slower from what they were saying. So hopefully we can see a better showing with Mercedes next race here coming up here in just a few days. Hopefully we can see something a little bit better, a little bit more competitive with them. What say you?
Mercedes looked very, very competitive. Russell had an amazing qualifying, finishing qualifying third, splitting the Ferrari pair. Early on in the race, he looked really, really strong, but he ended up having, like you said, he had a lot of overheating problems with the car. And then the tires just didn't over the stint, didn't hold up for them. So on a single lap, Mercedes looked really, really strong. It was just they had a few woes over the course of the race. Lewis Hamilton didn't have the greatest qualifying. I mean, he still made it into Q3 and qualified ninth, but he ends up coming home in seventh place, despite having the same overheating problems, the same tire degradation problems, and had a broken seat on top of that.
Yeah, exactly. Ferrari actually looked pretty good. Didn't suffer from bad strategy. They didn't suffer from tire deg. So they looked actually very good.
I think that the changes that Vassar has put in place had progressed at Ferrari. And I think that we saw even more evidence of the structure and the leadership that he has put in place at Ferrari has really righted the ship. I believe Ferrari was one of the ones that said that it was like 80 or 90% of the car was completely different from last year. And so little technical gremlins popped up. Leclerc had a absolutely amazing qualifying. Ferrari really did have a great weekend.
Yeah, most definitely.
So McLaren was another one. From what I thought that they would do, they had a little bit more of a disappointing weekend in the fact that, Lando qualified seventh, Oscar qualified eighth. Lando ends up coming home one better at sixth, and Oscar finished in eighth, right where he started from. I think a lot of it, though, just simply, again, it was those mechanical gremlins that caught out McLaren during qualifying. They fixed some of it, but a couple of things reared its head during the race, which caused the race pace to fall off a little bit. But I think, again, this is one of those things that it's going to get fixed sooner rather than later. I really think that right now it's Mercedes and McLaren are basically neck and neck with Ferrari breathing down Red Bull's neck. First off, we'll talk about Aston Martin. Had kind of a reverse of McLaren. Now, I have to give all the props in the world to Lance Stroll. We'll talk about Fernando here in just a minute, but I have to give so much props to Stroll, who he gets punted off at the first corner, and then through brilliant pit strategy and absolutely just put on a driving clinic and was able to go from dead last in the standings, after getting punted off at the first corner, to coming home and claiming the last points paying position at 10th. So I've just got to give all the kudos in the world to Stroll for that brilliant drive. And I hope that he keeps that up for the rest of the year. Okay, so on to Alpine. We suspected from testing that the Alpine had some issues that they were going to have to get sorted out. First and foremost, the fact that the car is grossly overweight. And so they end up qualifying 19th and 20th on the grid and end up only bringing it home in 17th and 18th. So it was a pretty disastrous weekend for Alpine.
It's going to take them a while. And by a while, it's probably going to be at least mid-season before they can figure out exactly what's happening with that car. I mean, McLaren figured it out halfway through the season, and look where they ended up last year. So
yes, absolutely.
It could come back to them, but they're in one of those spots too where they have two really talented drivers. If they don't do something soon, Ocon, Gasly, they're too good to be in 18th, 19th, even 16th place. They're too good drivers. Somebody else will snatch them up, no doubt about it.
Oh, so, yeah, absolutely.
Unless they want a driver change. And, right now you have a French team with French drivers. So if they want to keep that, they're going to have to do something very, very quickly.
Yep, absolutely. But one of the best things that I saw over the weekend was I saw on Instagram, somebody had posted a thing about Fernando and Piastri both breathing a sigh of relief because they dodged a bullet not being at Alpine right now. And one of the other things too, though, that I thought was also really funny, Jeremy Clarkson of Top Gear fame and the Grand Tour, for those who watch on Amazon Prime, he's become quite friendly with the Alpine team. He has provided them cases and cases of his own Hawkstone beer that's produced on his farm. He had taken a picture with the mechanics on the grid, and it said, "Should Jeremy Clarkson be the team principal?"
That's funny.
No, I don't think he should be the team principal, but by God, that would be entertaining as hell.
Most definitely.
It would most definitely be entertaining. All right, so let's talk about Williams. This was a tale of two races. I just shake my head about Logan Sargent. I don't know what to make of him, and so I want to hear your thoughts first.
His one issue wasn't really his issue. It was mechanical. Right? There was a problem with the throttle. He wasn't able to decelerate in time, so he pitched it straight forward off the track. He eventually joins, but by the time he's able to get back onto the track, the race is over. It's basically training day for Logan. But one thing that I saw though is that one, obviously he didn't give up. And two, he actually looked fairly decent when he got back on track and he was really going down. And I was looking at the timings. And again, it was a throwaway race for him. But the timings, just he was starting to bat down the timings much better than what I've seen him in the past. So he looked better. You know, obviously, if he didn't have the mechanical issues, who knows what would have happened, but he actually looked fairly decent.
The only reason why I bring it up is simply because in qualifying, he was 18th. The only ones worse than him were, of course, the two bloated Alpines. But the thing was, though, is that I don't know if maybe it was, again, maybe something that was going on during qualifying that was slowing him down, because during free practice, he was closer to Albon than I had ever seen him.
Yep.
And that's the reason why I quite know what to make of Logan right now, because I know that he has completely changed his training focus. He's completely changed his entire approach to the car. And like I said, during preseason testing and during free practice this last weekend, he was much, much closer to Alex than I had ever seen him.
Okay. To Sauber.
The biggest thing about Sauber's weekend is they didn't have the greatest qualifying. They wound up 16th and 17th, just right ahead of Logan Sargent at Williams and the two Alpines. But Joe Granu drove a really, really great race and just barely missed out on the points. But we have to talk about Bottas and the absolutely disastrous 52-second pit stop.
Yeah.
This is like NASCAR slow, or actually not even NASCAR slow. This is like world endurance car slow. Yeah. It's a mechanical thing that you can't foresee. But at the same time, why does it seem to keep happening at Sauber?
On the
Haas definitely showed much better form this year. Last year, as we talked about on a number of occasions, that the Haas was really good at a lot of the tracks. It was really good for one lap for qualifying. Right. But then as soon as they got into their race pace was atrocious compared to their qualifying pace. This weekend, we saw that the qualifying pace is still there, but they were much more consistent and they had much better consistency in their race pace.
Yeah, they looked much better. They looked much more solid. They're 19th and 20th. So
yeah,
they actually looked fairly good.
In the case of Magnussen, he qualified 15th and actually came home 12th. He was right behind Joe Granu and almost just barely missed out on the points. So the race pace of the Haas this year is definitely much better. Now, I know Hulkenberg had was those mechanical gremlins that he seemed to be catching just about everybody but Red Bull out this time around. Yeah. Poor Hulkenberg, he lost some time here and there around the track and everything because of the gremlins and stuff. So he ends up only bringing it home in a 16th. But all in all, it was a much better weekend out of Haas than what we're traditionally used to seeing.
Yeah, definitely.
So last but not least, we'll have to talk about Racing Bulls. Tsanoda, again, had a really great qualifying, just barely missed out on Q3. And Ricardo, who, even by his own admission, he is not the greatest qualifier. He's a much better racer than he is qualifier. But it's still a pretty respectable 14 for his qualifying. All in all, a pretty good session for them. But then they come in with Ricardo finishes 13th and Tsanoda comes in right behind him at 14th. But the biggest thing out of that was when Tsanoda was following behind Magnussen, they told him, let Ricciardo by, driver swap. And Tsanoda lost his
As he
Nike
should.
stick,
As he
which he
should.
should,
Yeah.
because he definitely had the pace. I think that within a few laps, he would have gotten around Magnussen, and they really should have allowed him to get around Magnussen, let Ricciardo get around Magnussen, and then if they wanted to do the driver swap, at that point, Grand U was far enough up the road that they probably were not going to catch Grand U anyway.
Especially given the amount of laps that were left when the team orders came through. It was dumb. Now, had they made those orders, say, 5 or 6 laps earlier, then yeah, most definitely Tsanoda. Ricciardo has better tires. He has faster tires. Move out of the way. Let's go get this guy, right? I totally understand. But with 2 or 3 laps left, making the team orders to move out of the way, I've said in the past that he's a hothead. He being Tsanoda is a hothead in the driver's seat. This time I fully agree with what he was saying. I don't see how you don't be that upset. And for the race, Ricciardo was calling him unprofessional. I don't see that being unprofessional at all. I really disagree with that. And the other thing that I wanted to add, I like Danny. I think he's a great guy. I think he's a great driver as well. But I'm not seeing a lot of his potential yet. So even last year, I understand he got injured and everything like that. But even after that, he had one race, which I would say is an outlier. Everything else, he was outside of points. 13th, 15th, 14th, 11th, all these places. And there wasn't a whole lot of races that he was actually leading Tsanoda. He's supposed to be the number one. I'm not seeing that so far. What are your thoughts?
No, I totally agree. And I can't quite put my finger on it. I don't know if it's just simply because the car isn't to his liking yet.
Look, 2 years at McLaren, he had the same results.
Yes,
he was always anywhere from 12th to 16th. That's what his range was.
Yeah. Now, admittedly, at McLaren, that was not a good car, because another interesting stat that I saw was the last 2 years, McLaren has scored 0 points in the first race of the season for the last 2 years. So admittedly, his 2 years at McLaren, the car was pretty freaking awful.
Understood. You know? But Norris led him there as well. And he, again, was supposed to be number one. He was.
I'm starting to question Ricciardo. Time will tell how this season goes, because as we've already seen what happened with DeVries last year, if the performance is not there, they don't have any. Red Bull and by extension, Racing Bulls have never had any problem with yanking a driver out unless the form increases dramatically. I can definitely see them making a driver change during the year. As we were finishing up last week's podcast, the news came out that Red Bull had cleared Horner of any wrongdoing and had closed the investigation, although they left it open for the right to appeal. And then shortly after that announcement was made, an unverified source apparently leaked a set of documents to every single one of the other team principals and a number of media outlets. Now, I have yet to see any media outlet that they sent that information to actually release any details about what was in there, all because, as they've all said, this is from an unverified source. And so for journalistic integrity, none of them have said anything about what was in those documents. But it's been a very tumultuous time. And even Jos Verstappen, Max's dad, even at one point came out and said, Christian needs to resign because otherwise the team's going to go up in flames. So your thoughts?
Well, that's from a man that hates Christian Horner. So
yes, that's very true.
So on to Sky Sports.
So I don't know if you did, because I'm guessing that you probably didn't see this, but during the pre-show, Sky Sports did something that I thought was really, really interesting. And it was really a lot of fun. 5 years ago, when Alex Albon, George Russell, and Lando Norris first all broke into Formula One together, these three guys are great friends. And there was actually even something that popped up on social media. I think it was either last week or the week before last. 5 years ago, when they first broke into Formula One, Sky Sports took the three of them to a go-kart track and let them run around. They had some fun with it and everything, and it was really entertaining. Well, 5 years on, they did it again before before the race at Bahrain, where they took and they had all three of them. And watching the three of them go at each other, and the yapping and the barking and everything, but all done in great fun. You can tell just how deep these guys' friendship goes. And I thought it was just really telling, first of all, how things have changed in Formula One, how even Damon Hill during the broadcast mentioned that he really didn't have a lot of friends who were fellow competitors, simply because by competitive nature, they didn't want to give anything away. Are you ready to call it?
Yep, ready.
Okay. So the checkered flag is waved on another episode of F1 Brake Check. We'll be back next week to break down the action from Jeddah and the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix. We'll also have a quick history of the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix, part 2 of our tech corner on F1 car setup, another Stump the Pundit, and lots more. So until we meet again, he's Corey, I'm Scott, we're the pundits of F1 Brake Check. Let's go!
Thank you for listening to F1 Brake Check. If you have enjoyed what you heard, don't miss a single episode by hitting that subscribe button in your favorite podcatcher. Also, help us grow by sharing us with your friends and fellow F1 fans. We value your feedback and passion, so please take a moment to review our podcast. Your reviews help us grow and improve, and it means the world to us. Share your thoughts, rate us, and let us know how we can make the show experience even better. F1 Brake Check is a production of Brake Check Media. For your hosts Scott Vick and Corey Broom, until next time, stay inside track limits, and try not to pitch it in the kitty litter.